It was clear I needed a new approach. What might even be considered a scientific approach, beginning by taking a closer look at the details of the biblical story.
The oldest accounts of the Exodus were written down in Hebrew, in the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah.
I asked Rabbi Manis Friedman, a member of Judaism's Orthodox branch, to recount the ancient stories of the Bible from these sacred scrolls. In order to test the Exodus fairly, I wanted to know what the story was actually claiming.
The story of the Exodus begins before the Israelites leave Egypt. It begins with Abraham, when God brings him to the land of Canaan and makes a covenant with him. And in that covenant spells out the entire Exodus. The Lord said to Abraham, "All this land you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. Go, walk through the length and breadth of this land, for I am giving it to you." On that day, the Lord made a covenant, a formal promise to Abraham. He said, "To your descendants I give this land." God led Abraham outside, and he said, "Look up to heaven and count the stars, if you can. So numerous will your offspring be." And God said, "Your descendants will be foreigners in a country not their own. They will be enslaved and oppressed. But I will judge the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions and return here."
According to the text, the events of the Exodus were not a historical accident. They were directed by the God of Abraham every step of the way.
As my team and I looked more closely at this account, we could see that these biblical events formed a sequence that could guide the entire investigation. I imagined the 6 steps of the biblical sequence, the major events of the Exodus story running parallel to Egyptian history, starting with the arrival of Abraham's descendants in Egypt, their tremendous multiplication, their descent into slavery, the judgment of the nation that enslaved them, their deliverance and exodus out of Egypt, and finally in Canaan, their conquest of the Promised Land. If the Exodus really happened, there are elements in the story that are so big that you'd think some remnants of evidence would have been left behind, somewhere in Egypt's history. We knew science solved problems by looking for patterns of evidence, and a truly scientific approach looks for those patterns no matter where they exist. I set out to see whether a pattern matching this sequence could be found, starting with the first step, the arrival of the Israelites in Egypt.
The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down to Egypt. Then, in an amazing turn of events, he rises to become the highest official in Egypt. He saves the country from a terrible famine, enables his father Jacob and his entire family to settle in the best part of the land, a place called Goshen.
My objective was to see if any specific evidence had been uncovered of the Semitic family group arriving in Egypt, as told in the Bible. So far, I had none.
So far, not. We only know we have some evidence of shepherders. So far, not.
I was stuck, but that was soon to change, when suddenly something was telling me to go to my library and search out a book given to me a year earlier, that I had never read. What startled me was that this author had answers to the very doubts that Bitek had raised in me. He had spent his whole life exploring the Middle East, a man familiar with the mysterious inscriptions and hieroglyphs of the pharaohs, and what they might reveal about the biblical stories.
David Rohl, author, historian, and Egyptologist, is an agnostic, someone who remains unconvinced of the existence of God. Yet, he clearly sees archaeological evidence of the biblical Joseph, Jacob, and the early Hebrews in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. Rohl believes that many Egyptologists have missed evidence for the Exodus because they have been looking for it in the wrong time period. While most scholars think that the events of the Exodus happened in the New Kingdom, David Rohl's view would put the Exodus in an entirely different period, the earlier Middle Kingdom, where he claims evidence for the Exodus can be seen.
I wanted him to explain why he had come to such a different conclusion than Manfred Bitek about Joseph and the early Israelites. Tell me, who is Manfred Bitek?
Manfred Bitek is probably one of the greatest archaeologists alive today, and he's dug at one of the most important sites in the Eastern Delta, a city called Avaris, which is in the land of Goshen, which the Bible calls it, and I believe this is the place where Joseph and his brethren lived.
Well, I went to see Manfred Bitek.
Right.
And that's not what he said. He said there's no evidence of this at the time of Ramesses.
Exactly right. Most scholars will say if you look at the city of Ramesses, there are no Asiatics there. There are no Western Asiatics living at that particular city. But dig down a little bit deeper, and you do find a city full of Asiatics.
Yeah, but the Bible says it happened at the time of Ramesses. Mm-hmm. What are you saying?
I'm saying that this particular mention of the city of Ramses, the building of Ramses, is what we call an anachronism. It's something that's been added into the text later by an editor. Mm-hmm. So what the editor is basically saying is, this is the place where the Israelites built the store city, and we know it today as Ramesses. Well, but in the ancient times, it was called Avaris.
Okay, so the people would know the area, the region.
The people of the Bible would have known where Ramesses was and where, therefore, their ancestors actually built the city.
I also found that the Bible, in the book of Genesis, uses the word Ramesses hundreds of years before Pharaoh Ramesses or his city existed to describe the land where Joseph's family settled. So if the name Ramesses in Genesis does not refer to the time of Pharaoh Ramesses II, then why should the mention of Ramesses in the book of Exodus be any different?
Now this Avaris is the city which lies under the biblical Ramesses. Ramesses of the New Kingdom, Avaris of the Middle Kingdom, the 13th dynasty. It lies underneath the city that's mentioned in the Bible. So when Bitek digs up a huge population of Semitic-speaking peoples with Semitic culture living in the city of Avaris for several hundred years, and then, at the end of the period, these Semites all leave, depart with their belongings and abandon the city, whatever Manfred says, that to me sounds awfully like the Israelites.
Well, what he told me was that there was no connection.
Well, look at the evidence that you've got here.
Right at the beginning, at the heart of this community, at the end of the 12th dynasty,
we see a Syrian house appear. The Austrians call them Mittelsaal houses. This type of house is found in North Syria, the area where Abraham came from. It's exactly the same style of house you'd expect Jacob to build for himself in Egypt. And we know that the Israelites sought their brides from Haran in that region. They all went back to get their brides from there. So the culture that turns up in Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty seems to have come from North Syria originally.
So what is the connection with Joseph out of Avaris?
Well, after this house of Jacob, if we can call it that, is built, eventually it's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. However, the occupant was not Egyptian.
The palace had courtyards, colonnades, audience chambers. There was even a robing room.
It obviously belonged to some high official of state who was very, very important to that state. Because when somebody gets a palace like this given to them, it means they're being honored for what they've done for the state.
Now, in the garden behind the palace, the archaeologists found 12 main graves with memorial chapels on top of them.
You have 12
We
graves.
have 12 graves.
And why would that be significant?
Well, think about it. How many sons did Jacob have?
Yeah, 12.
How many tribes were there?
12 tribes.
Exactly. And what's also amazing is the palace had a facade, a portico with 12 pillars. So you've got 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 pillars, and 12 tombs.
Interesting.
Yeah. Is that all coincidence?
Now, one of these 12 graves was very special because it was a pyramid tomb. This in itself is extraordinary because only pharaohs and queens had pyramid tombs at this time. Yet the person buried in this tomb was not a king. Even so, he was honored with a king's burial. And inside the chapel of the tomb was a statue. What we know from the statue is that this man had red hair. He had pale yellow skin, which is how Egyptians depict northerners. He had a throw stick across his shoulder, a unique symbol of office made for this Asiatic official living in the land of Goshen. And on the back of his shoulder, we see the faintest remains of paint, colored stripes from a multicolored coat.
And that matches exactly with the story of Joseph in the Bible. The multicolored coat is a gift which shows that he was the favorite of the father. And it almost becomes his insignia, this coat. It's the thing we remember about him most of all.
Do you know of any other statues of a Semite of this kind in Egypt?
There is nothing else like this in the whole of Egyptian history.
Really?
Nothing at all.
David Rowe is not the only one to see a connection with Joseph at Avaris. Mahoney went to see Professor Charles Ayling, an Egyptologist who has also investigated the events of the Exodus and its connection to Egypt.
Would it be unusual for a tomb to have a statue?
No. It's unusual to have one this large. This would be probably twice the size of a normal human being.
What does that tell you when the statue's larger?
That it's a very important person. Now, of course, this is not a pharaoh's tomb or palace, but the man who lived there, you can identify his nationality by looking at the fragments of the statue. Three things: the hairstyle he has, which we often call the mushroom hairstyle, and then secondly, the weapon he carries over his shoulder called a throw stick, which we would associate with like an Australian boomerang, and then the coloration of the skin. The skin is yellow. All those things indicate that this would have been a Syro-Palestinian.
Dr. Ayling, do you think this is Joseph?
Either it is Joseph or it's somebody that has a career remarkably the same as Joseph did. It's just an incredible thing to find this at this time period.
The Exodus was a story about the birth of a nation. It was time for Mahoney to go to Israel. This gave him the unique opportunity to meet with Israel's president, Shimon Peres, and hear his perspective about the character of Joseph and his rise from slavery to governing Pharaoh's court.
If you look at the way the story is written, God chose him for a mission.
I read somewhere that Tolstoy said that this is the greatest story ever published in human literature. The story of Joseph and his brother and his going to Egypt. Joseph was the first Jewish advisor on earth. And he advised the most powerful empire in the vicinity. He conquered the heart of everybody he saw, men and women.
With God's help, Joseph was able to save Egypt by warning of a coming calamity. 7 years of plenty would be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. Pharaoh is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of preparing for the famine and makes him second in command over the entire country.
He managed to achieve this by foretelling or explaining the dreams of Pharaoh about cattle coming out of the waters of the Nile. As first of all 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean cows come out and devour the fat cows. It's an extraordinary story. But the clue here is that these cows are coming out of the Nile. It's the Nile itself which is the cause of both the plenty and the famine.
If David's interpretation is right, then the regulation of the Nile may have been key in planning for the coming famine.
There's a canal or waterway that connects the Nile to the Fayum Basin, which is a large lake area, which has the name Bahr Yosef, which means the waterway of Joseph. And this goes back thousands of years as far as we can tell.
Why do you think that that canal has that name?
Because I think he made it. I think it was under his instructions as Vizier of Egypt that that canal was cut. And it was cut to divert half the water from the Nile into the Fayum Basin. You then get back to the situation where the water levels are just right for growing crops.
Can you see it today?
It's still in use today.
And the construction of this water diversion system is dated to the same period as the early settlement at Avaris.
Joseph gathers up all the grain during the 7 years of plenty in Egypt. He gathered as much as the sand of the sea. And then the famine comes to the entire region, and only Egypt has bread. So everyone comes to Joseph for what they need for survival. When their money runs out, they sold their animals. When that ran out, they sold their land, and eventually they sold themselves. So Pharaoh, by the end of the 7 years, owns everything in Egypt.
Mahoney wanted to know if there ever was a time in this era when a dramatic shift of wealth and power occurred between the people of Egypt and the Pharaoh. He went to Pennsylvania to see an archaeologist who spent many years studying the Exodus and the conquest. His name is Dr. Bryant Wood.
When we look at Egyptian history, we find something very significant happen at this exact time. Egypt was divided up into areas called nomes, kind of like districts all over the country. And the leaders of these nomes had tremendous wealth and tremendous power. We get to a point in Egyptian history when suddenly that all changes and all the wealth is concentrated with the Pharaoh. What on earth happened here? If you read the Egyptian history books, there is no explanation for it. They don't know what happened, how it happened. I mean, this was a tremendous social, economic change.
Well, what do you think happened?
Well, we have the answer in the Bible, and it's Joseph's famine policy, and he brings the wealth into Pharaoh, and it fits exactly with Egyptian history.
David believes these events occurred during the reigns of two important Middle Kingdom pharaohs.
This key time is during the co-regency between Senusret III and his son Amenemhat III. I believe this is the time of the famine, and that Amenemhat was Joseph's pharaoh. Amenemhat is depicted with worry lines. His ears are turned out so that he can listen to the concerns of the people. He's not depicted in the usual bland way that you see in all the other statues of past and future pharaohs. And I think this is an indication that in his time, Egypt was experiencing serious problems. And guess what? He builds his pyramid right next to Bahr Yosef, the waterway of Joseph.
The amount of archaeological evidence matching the first step of arrival in the biblical sequence seemed overwhelming to Mahoney. The Syrian-styled house that appeared in the Delta along with a palace fit for royalty, whose occupant was a high Semitic official from the Canaan area who wore a multicolored coat. The waterway of Joseph, contemporary with the rise of Avaris. The end of influence and wealth for the regional governors as the power of Pharaoh reached new heights. Yet these events converged at a time when the statues of the pharaohs were depicted in a unique, careworn way, the telltale signs of a kingdom in distress.
Well, why is it that we've never heard of these finds?
Because in the scheme that's used by scholars to date all these events, they're way too early. They're much too early to be Israelites. I'm basically saying, well, why not call a spade a spade?
At the pyramid tomb of Avaris, excavations revealed one other important piece of evidence.
The crucial clue for me, which says to me that this man with the multicolored coat is Joseph, is found in the story of Exodus. When Joseph is on his deathbed, he tells his brethren that when they leave, they must take his body with them to the promised land. What matches the story even more incredibly is that pyramid tomb was empty when the archaeologists found it. There was nothing in it at all apart from a few fragments of this smashed statue. There were no bones, there's no mummy beads, no coffin wood, nothing. It was cleaned out.
So it was a grave robber.
Not a grave robber. What grave robber is going to take the bones? Bones are intrinsically of no value whatsoever.
Okay.
Nobody takes the bones. Only people who are treating the body with reverence take the bones. The body was taken out, and all the grave goods were taken out. I think this is the tomb of Joseph, the pyramid tomb of Joseph, honored by Pharaoh with a colossal statue, that when Moses decided to take the people out of Egypt, he made sure he fulfilled that promise of Joseph to take the body out of the tomb and take it to Shechem and bury him in the promised land.
This location, photographed in the 1800s, is where many believe Joseph's bones were finally laid to rest in the ancient town of Shechem in Canaan. The city is known today as Nablus on the West Bank, where this tomb has been at the center of much political and religious tension.